4 phases of crime scene investigation. These are the 4 phases: arriving at the scene, that is the first responders, that would not be us. The preliminary documentation and evaluation of the scene, that's when we are arriving and we are involved. Then the third is processing the scene, and that's totally us. We may have some assistants, we may have some specialists come in. We might call someone from the crime lab to come and assist with something specialized, but that's us, processing the scene. And then the last phase is completing and recording the crime scene investigation. So let's now move to the third phase, processing the scene. Keep in mind that crime scenes can really be a challenge. Talking now about major crime scene. Homicides, definitely, but there could be other scenes that are considered major scenes that you would be throwing all your effort into. And these major scenes can be very intimidating. Also, just processing a crime scene can sometimes be a little disheartening because the results are not often tangible. You work hours or days, and then you just move on to the next crime scene. And you may not hear much about, well, what did that case end up being? Was anybody arrested? Did it go to trial? So it's sometimes easy to get a little discouraged. You wonder, why am I doing all of this at such a intense level if it doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot of good? Communication is really important. When I got into management, my last department, one of the things I insisted on was that the detectives would communicate with everyone involved in the case every time something significant happened. There's the first responders, they take the initial report, they may make the arrest at the scene. You come in, you process the scene. The detectives then do follow-up, and maybe they find out something really significant. So they should be letting you and the first responders know about it, and the dispatcher that sent them, because everybody was involved. And then when it goes to the DA, I sent it to the DA. We're waiting to hear back. Just updates like that. And then if there's a plea bargain or the DA says, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole, whatever, the detective lets everybody know. And that's pretty important. So look for that in an agency, and talk to your supervisor about getting feedback as well. It is very helpful. You process this scene and it could be years before anything really happens with it. Never let up. Never let up. That's easy to say, of course. There'll be more notoriety in some cases. There'll be people looking over your shoulder more in some cases. Let's look at what we do when we're processing a scene in this whole scheme of the phases of an investigation. Well, in the phase for processing the scene, we have determine team composition, ensure contamination control, documentation, prioritize evidence collection, crime scene search, collect, preserve, inventory, package, transport, and submit evidence. Then we're going to go into more detail about crime scene evidence collection. And then there's even crime scene reconstruction. Remember, we have a detective or someone who's guiding this investigation, and that person is responsible for assessing the scene to determine how many CSIs are necessary, any specialized resources, and so forth. Further, once you have done that walkthrough that we've already talked about, you're going to probably, as CSIs, if there's more than one of you, huddle up and decide who's going to do what things. You may decide to specialize, and one person do photography, another person do the sketch, and another person collect the evidence, whatever it may be. It's essential to a successful investigation to select a team of trained personnel to perform scene processing based on the type of incident and the complexity of the scene. You might call in additional people. Usually, you and I are kind of jacks of all trade. We do it all. We're generalists. We're going to do the photography. We're going to do the sketching. We're going to do the evidence collection. We may even be doing the fingerprint comparisons. all of that stuff. And that's fine, because that's stuff we can all learn, we can all excel at. The next point in that phase is ensure contamination control. Contamination control and preventing cross-contamination at single or multiple scenes is essential to maintaining the safety of personnel and the integrity of evidence. So the investigator in charge shall require all personnel to follow procedures to ensure scene safety and evidence integrity. Keep in mind the evidence, cross-contamination. You don't want to transfer anything from one item of evidence to another, or from yourself to the item of evidence. As we are doing this crime scene, the next point is we prioritize the collection of evidence. And we must do that to prevent loss, destruction, or contamination. So we look at our scene and say, all right, is there anything here that's transient in nature? I mean, it's going to disappear if we don't do it right away. And it might be something like an outdoor scene with a footwear impression and it's beginning to rain. Well, you better take care of that footwear impression first, so it doesn't just wash away. We look at our scene, we decide how we're going to do this. Before any evidence collection occurs, we should consider crime scene reconstruction. That's where we try to use the evidence to determine what occurred at the time of the crime. Sometimes you can tell that just by looking at footprints in the blood or something of that nature. But often we're talking about, in firearms cases, bullet trajectories. That would be the direction of a flight of a bullet. How many shots were fired, where the shooter was when the shots were fired, where the victim or the object that received the gunshot was positioned when that gunshot was fired. So let's say that in determining that, we have a bullet path that goes through a lampshade. Well, you definitely would not want to say, okay, it's time to collect evidence. Let's collect this lampshade. And you take the lampshade, you put it in the paper bag, and then decide to do crime scene reconstruction. Because now you've moved something that a bullet passed through. You're not going to really be able to recreate that very well. You can look at your photographs and put it back and go, oops, I made a mistake. But you've lost some of the integrity of your reconstruction. Those things need to be considered before, if at all possible, collecting evidence. Now, once in a while, you get partway through and you go, hey, I'm starting to see something here. But hopefully we can do our reconstruction before we have moved anything of significance. As far as this crime scene processing, we need to search the scene. A thorough search of a crime scene helps ensure that relevant evidence will be recognized, documented, and collected. So the investigator in charge shall consider different search strategies for crime scenes depending on the locale and the number of officials available to aid in searching. Really, this is going to fall on you and I. The detective or whoever's leading the investigation is probably not going to tell you, I think you need to use a spiral search here. Now, they're really not going to do that. You and I are going to decide how we're going to search. Now, there are 4 types of search methodology that can be considered to search a crime scene. We have the lane or strip search. We have the grid search, the zone search, and the spiral search. This is going to depend on your circumstances, how much area you have. Are you searching the interior of a vehicle? Are you searching a bedroom? Are you searching a large field? It's going to be dependent on what you have. So let's look at the different searches and talk about how they might be useful. A very simple one is the lane or strip search. And basically you just walk in a straight line. And if you have more than one person doing this shoulder to shoulder, you're just walking in a straight line and looking. You can also vary that lane so that it goes like that. So you're going back and forth. You see, that's a way to cover carefully the area. If you have multiple people searching an area, because this could be used outdoors as well, what you want to make sure is you don't space yourselves out too far. Closer is better. And it really depends on what terrain you're working in. If you're going through a field and it has deep grass, you're going to need to be like shoulder to shoulder going through, because as you look to the side, that deep grass makes it impossible to see down. So you need to really be pretty much looking straight down. So does the next person next to you and the next person next to him or her. If it's just a parking lot, then you could be at arm's length between each person.
A second way is to use the grid search. Now, grid search is a bit like a lane search, but you change direction and double back. Well, let's start here. You start here, you go across and back and across and back, and then you do it the other direction like so. That way, you're covering every area twice. And that helps you to be a little more thorough. Takes twice as long, but it gives you a much more thorough search of the area. And then the third search technique is the one I prefer, especially indoors, and that is the zone search. Now, with a zone search, basically all you do is you divide the area to be searched into smaller areas or zones. And then each one of these zones is searched one at a time very thoroughly. Let's say if this was a room here, I would probably make the zone even smaller than what you see on the screen. I would choose a smaller area. I take a small area and then I search it very carefully. I'm going to use my flashlight, because what I'll do is use my light at a low oblique angle on the floors, on furniture. Often there'll be things that blend in with the floor, and use an oblique angle and then see your evidence more clearly. Also, what that flashlight allows you to do is focus your attention into a smaller area. If you just walk in and kind of look around, I don't see anything here, you'll never find anything, except the big stuff that you're going to trip over anyway. Finding small items, you need to be very focused and look at small areas at a time. By using a flashlight, I can paint the whole area slowly, looking carefully, making sure I don't miss any area. And in those small areas, use my light at an oblique angle, causing shadows. So I can look underneath furniture, I can lift cushions and look under cushions, look behind pillows. I can look in lampshades, I can look at the ceiling, the walls. Don't forget to look at the ceiling, in drawers, whatever I need to do, and I'm very thorough. So once I have finished covering one of these zones, then I can move to the next zone. And what is helpful is if there is more than one of you there, is somebody else follows you and does your zone, your first zone, once you're done. And let them see if they find anything. Now, as you find things, you're probably going to use your markers. Zone search is also very helpful in something like a vehicle. So you can just say that the driver's side or left side front seat area would be zone 1. The back seat area on the driver's side or left side would be zone 2. Zone 3, passenger side, front. Zone 4, back seat. And then zone 5, the trunk, and zone 6, the engine compartment. Search them one at a time. If instead what you did was just lean in and look at the whole front area, you'd probably miss things. So we take our time and we do it by zones. Then the fourth way of searching is the spiral search. So with a spiral search, you can do it one of two ways. You can start in the middle of your scene and work your way outward, or you could actually start outside the scene and work your way inward, though that seems to be much more difficult to kind of keep track of where you are. Now, where would you use this? Well, I definitely would not use this indoors unless we're talking about an indoor stadium and it's the playing field, something like that. Maybe that might be a time to do the spiral search. But typically what we find is we use that outdoors and for a scene such as a bombing scene. So you have an explosion, you'll have a crater, you'll have the initial point of explosion, and you can start there and then just start searching by walking in a spiral fashion, going outward, looking for evidence. And then you just keep going until you run out of evidence, and then go some more. And then when you're satisfied you've covered the area, you stop. Now, a couple things to keep in mind there is, number one, when you're walking to the center, you may be walking over evidence. So you have to be very careful, see where you're stepping. Then second is, there's a tendency when some people do this, when they get further out, the spacing gets larger. But keep it nice and tight. Again, tight enough so that you can see everything as you go by each time in that area that you're supposed to see, that there's no gaps. So we have the lane or strip search, the grid search, the zone search, and the spiral search. Next point on processing the crime scene, we're going to collect, preserve, inventory, package, transport, and submit evidence. The team members, that's all of you, are going to ensure that we collect the evidence correctly, we preserve it properly, we package it in the right materials, and then we transport it to be booked into evidence. And the handling of physical evidence is one of the most important factors of the investigation. We need to handle it properly so that we maintain the integrity of the evidence, we do not contaminate it, and then it will be effective for our case. The chain of custody, of course, all of that is part of this. Another point in the processing of a crime scene, detailed evidence collection. This is where we're going to collect any and all potential evidence. So that's one of the steps that we take. Again, we talked about doing this after we have discussed whether we need to do crime scene reconstruction. And if we do, we leave that evidence alone until the reconstruction is finished. Here we have a little information about that. What is crime scene reconstruction? Well, as it says on that slide, the use of scientific methods, physical evidence, deductive reasoning, and their interrelationships to gain explicit knowledge of the series of events that surround the commission of a crime. This is a very deliberate process. We're going to look at our evidence. We're going to do some calculations, perhaps, as with bloodstain pattern interpretation, where we're even going to measure bloodstain and get angles from that. We're going to use our deductive reasoning and how the evidence all interrelates in order to come up with conclusions. Now, this is very important because a lot of what we do is prove or disprove witnesses and suspects and even victims' statements. And so being able to prove out how things happen is very important. Bloodstain pattern analysis is a good example. You can identify where people were, their identity, whose blood was it, the number of blows that were given, that sort of stuff. So bloodstain pattern analysis, very important for reconstruction. Firearms is another really good example. We can learn about trajectory, which is the path of the bullet. That could be very important to our case. Shooting distance, gunshot residue, and so forth. So crime scene reconstruction is something that we do at many scenes, not all, but when you have an opportunity, hopefully you're not going to miss it. So we have covered 3 of the 4 major phases of processing a crime scene. The arriving at the scene, which is the first responders, and then the detective shows up, the preliminary documentation and evaluation, the detective is in charge. Do we need a search warrant? Then we show up, we get our walkthrough, we decide what we're going to do. The 3rd phase is we process the scene, and then the 4th phase is completing and recording the crime scene investigation.